Hey everyone, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for helping me reach 100 subscribers. I honestly couldn't have done this without your love, support, and constant encouragement. Every like, comment, and subscribe means a lot to me. Now let's keep this journey going. Our next target is 200 subscribers, and I know we can do it together. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's grow as a family. Thank you once again. In the new world, the Straw Hats are stronger than ever, until everything changes overnight. Luffy falls ill with a mysterious sickness that even Chopper cannot diagnose. As their captain drifts in and out of danger, fear spreads through the crew. Tensions rise, arguments spark, and the unity that once made them unstoppable begins to crack. When Luffy's identity itself starts to shift, the Straw Hats are forced to confront a terrifying question. Are they still a family without the captain they know and love? This is a story of bonds tested, hearts breaking, and whether friendship alone is enough to keep a crew from becoming strangers. Disclaimer: this story do not belong to me. The author is A Case of Identity by Nico 11. Respect to author.
Chapter 1 Darkness. Sanji was busy chopping vegetables. He was fully concentrated on his task. Chunk, chunk, chunk. Next carrot. Chunk, 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 like an old clock that never gets tired of moving its second hand across the clock face. Always ticking in the same rhythm, tick, tick, tick. The only difference was the sound it was making. Beside the chopping sound the cook produced, nothing else could be heard. It was unusually quiet and there was an unreadable atmosphere in the air. Whatever it wasn't comfortable and far from happiness. Usopp and Brook were sitting at the kitchen table but no word was spoken. It felt as if the cook was all alone in his kitchen and he nearly forgot about the two's presence. In fact, both the sniper and the musician completely forgot about Sanji's presence. They just sat there, blank looks crossing their features. Each of them were focused on a different spot on the table and seemingly lost in thoughts. But who could blame them, after all that's happened? Chunk, chunk, chunk. Usopp slowly looked up, no expression on his pale face. Brook didn't move. Chunk, chunk, chunk. Do you think he'll make it? Usopp's unusually monotone-sounding voice broke through the air like water would crash through an old barrage. Chunk, chew cling. The knife clashed to the stone floor. Brook flinched and turned to look up, too, only to find the normally calm cook shaking with anger. But what surprised him even more was the fact that Usopp didn't even blink. The long-nosed man just looked at Sanji with cold calmness that sent shudders down Brook's spine. What did you say? Sanji all but spat. I mean it, Sanji, do you think that he'll make it through the night at all? Usopp repeated with the same, low voice, no change in his expression. Last night had been pretty close. Usopp-san looked so old and tired, Brook couldn't help but think. If he had a lip, he would have bitten down on it until he bled. That sight before him was so disturbing, so abnormal it was creepy. Where had all those happiness and lust for life vanished to? Brook didn't need to ask out loud. He already knew the answer. The moment they stepped onto Garino Island they left all of that behind, and probably even more. What the fuck, Usopp? The sniper didn't answer and just continued to stare ahead, but he didn't look at Sanji anymore. Brook noticed that his glance stretched far ahead, maybe into some other space neither Sanji nor the skeleton could reach at the moment. Usopp wasn't present with his thoughts, he was lost in another world of dread and darkness. In a way, they all were. But each of them dealt with it differently. Brook wasn't even sure if they were all aware of the changes they'd gone through. How their bond seemed to stretch more and more, driving them all further apart without anyone putting a stop to it. Maybe they didn't have the strength to prevent the inevitable. Maybe they weren't such great nakama after all, or maybe they depended too much on him in the end. No matter what was wrong or right at the moment, it was obvious that without Luffy they couldn't go on. Realizing this one by one was destroying them even more. How could they stand up and pretend everything was all right if there was so much wrong right now? Was there a way to get out of this without a scratch? If there was, then how could they find it without the help of their compass? They were lost in an endless mist without him. The captain of a ship shouldn't put all the pressure just at the crew's shoulders like that. But he did. He left them to fight on their own, a battle that wasn't about good or bad. They were fighting against an enemy you couldn't beat. The thing that could be kind and gentle and make your life exciting, or tempt you with its charm and then stab you in the back. It seemed hopeless. Because in the end, it was a shame you couldn't turn back time. You heard me the first time, Sanji. Usopp answered without putting any emotion into his voice. Sanji bit his lip and, in a moment of blind anger, slammed his hand onto the counter. The rest of the crew was somewhere on the ship, everyone seeking some time on their own. They still heard the argument that broke out between Sanji and Usopp. No, argument wasn't the right word. Friends had arguments, but no one of them felt like they shared friendship with each other anymore. They felt like strangers, randomly thrown at the same ship and locked up to fight each other. That's what Sanji and Usopp did. Fighting. How could this all have come this far? Weren't they a family? The Straw Hats all thought along those lines, sometime when they just stared ahead and thought of the happy times. But no one managed to open their mouth and spread some warmth where it was missing. After all, they all had their special purpose on this ship. But if someone suddenly couldn't fulfill his purpose anymore, the others quickly found themselves in a deep dilemma. The order was cracked, all of a sudden there was a huge gap between them no one could fill. It kept on growing and threatened to swallow them whole. Luffy won't die. He won't, Sanji shouted. To the others it seemed as if he was in deep rage of what Usopp had dared to suggest. Though anyone who looked twice knew Sanji was just trying to tell himself that his captain was immortal. But he wasn't. Even someone like the future Pirate King could do nothing while being in the clutches of death. No matter what Luffy had managed to come out of alive, this was something that didn't depend on strength or optimism. A sickness could drag anyone towards the dark abyss. Chapter 2 Out of the Blue. A few days before, the infamous Straw crew had just left another island behind. Another exciting adventure had passed and they were all alive and well. It was good to be back together again. No, that's not true. It was even better. All of them were 3 times stronger than they were 2 years ago, and their wish to complete and charge their dreams was stronger than ever. They felt like nothing that stood in their way, Marine Admiral or Pirate Captain, could stop them. They were more powerful than anyone, and the way they could always rely on each other made them nearly invincible. At least, that's what they felt like, strong and invincible. Nami, Usopp and Chopper had to admit, the new world was twice as scary and unpredictable as the normal Grand Line, but they had twice as much fun, too. The Straw Hats had the time of their lives. Especially at the island they were currently docked at, Burrino Island. The weather was fine, they had already restocked their supplies, and the whole crew was in a great mood. The main reason was a small marine base that was at the end of the town. They had been walking through the town together when suddenly, a young marine soldier had pointed at them and shouted hysterically. "Ooh, it's the Straw Pirates," the marine soldier shouted, torn between a mix of joy and terror. After all of the crew members had an extremely high bounty on their heads. If they managed to catch them, they'd be rich and honored. People would finally begin to pay the marine the respect they deserved, especially at this island where everyone just laughed at them. It was their chance, and they didn't fail to seize it. Most of the Straw Hats smirked at this. Since they were all in high spirits this morning and Nami had been shopping before, no one minded a small quarrel with the marine. It was supposed to be a short fight, just for fun, nothing more. And so the fight began. The Straw crew didn't even use their strongest moves, it wasn't necessary. The bunch of half-trained marine fighters was just as worse as their leader, Lieutenant Hale. The man was scared to no end and sweated up a storm as he shouted orders, barking at his men to take them down finally. "Nami Swan, Robin Kwan, don't worry. I shall protect you with my life. I won't let those filthy marines lay a finger on you," Sanji declared and stormed off to take down marine fighters. The 2 women watched the blonde-haired man fight and giggled. The swordsman just rolled his eyes at the cook's actions and joined in the fight, slashing down some of the guys. "Che, these guys are a pain in the ass," Zoro muttered. "Damn, this is boring. If I had at least some sake with me." Brook laughed happily. "I agree, Zoro-san. I've never seen such weak marines, though now that I think about it I actually don't have eyes to see." "Yo-ho-ho." Luffy giggled at the joke as he punched someone into the face. Chopper watched this and frowned for a moment because somehow, Luffy seemed a little unsteady on his feet. He wobbled slightly before he caught himself and straightened his back again. What was that? Then the reindeer shook his head, it was probably just his imagination. Luffy and unsteady. "Ha, oi, Luffy, stop messing around, I still have to complete some maps on the ship," Nami complained, striking some poor marines with a thunderbolt.
Yo, quick pause, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here, share this video, and tell me in the comments which part you're loving the most.
The others agreed, encouraging Luffy to use Gear 3rd. Luffy smiled at his crew's grinning faces and nodded. "Ooh," he simply said, lifting his right hand to blow some air into his thumb. Of course, everyone recognized this familiar pose. The Marines screamed in terror, the Straw Hats cheered, and suddenly, Luffy dropped to the ground like a sack of potatoes. "Luffy!" Some of his crewmates shouted, unable to move at first. A few gasps were heard from the crew, and then there was nothing but a collective silence. Almost immediately, as if someone pressed the pause button, everyone fell silent, too surprised to utter a single vocal. All fighting stopped, not even the clash of 2 swords were heard, they all turned and stared. To say his crew was shocked was the understatement of the century. Everything had been fine, and all of a sudden their leader just fainted. None of them knew how to react at the moment. The moment Luffy's eyes rolled to the back of his head and his knees buckled underneath him, Zoro felt like someone grasped his throat and squeezed as hard as he could. It was a bizarre scene, a terrible joke of fate that no one was prepared for. Nami looked absolutely terrified, and she clasped her hands over her mouth. What happened? Luffy-san. Brook gaped at the scene before him, the marine guy he was fighting against forgotten. The rest of Luffy's nakama stood there frozen, trying to comprehend what had just happened and if this was just one of Luffy's stupid jokes. Surely they'd see him laughing his butt off seeing their shocked faces, right? The marine fighters acted in a similar fashion. They didn't trust the silence and were very careful in their next steps. Was this a new fighting trick? They didn't know, but they felt like Mugiwara no Luffy was just playing with them at the moment. Those brave men didn't dare to near the dead-like person on the ground, fearing Luffy would jump up and laugh and beat them all in less than 2 seconds. He didn't have an extremely high bounty for nothing after all. Quickly, the shock wore off and the straw hats began to move again. Most of them gaped save for Usopp and Nami who giggled half-heartedly, attempting to lift the mood. Luffy, you idiot, why do you always have to scare us like that? Usopp said, shaking his head. Nami sighed dramatically but didn't hide her awkward grin. Geez, I was really worried there for a second, get up, baka. Frankie decided to join in the complaining and whined something about a not-so-super stunt Luffy just pulled. Brook, yo-ho-hoed, and the rest just rolled their eyes. Luffy could be such a bother. But Zoro frowned. Something felt wrong there. Whatever had just happened, it was definitely not Luffy's doing. Zoro was angry at the others because he knew they all sensed something wrong but tried to play it off as a joke. Couldn't they see the whole situation was escalating? Even the Marines seemed to realize something was off. Oi, this is enough, can't you see the ladies don't like your stupid joke, Luffy? Sanji grumbled and kicked one Marine fighter into the face. Chopper, who was fighting next to him, began to run towards the fallen boy. It wasn't just his doctor mode that pushed him to his captain. Chopper feared for Luffy's well-being because he was the reindeer's friend and by the looks of it, Luffy had to be gravely injured. The 19-year-old still hadn't moved from his spot and the little reindeer knew Luffy hadn't just fallen asleep. Luffy, he squeaked, trying to prevent his voice from quivering so much. So it hadn't been his imagination after all. Luffy had been unsteady before. The reindeer cursed himself. He should have reacted and checked up on the boy immediately. But now it was too late to ponder about what should have been done. Chopper just blinked helplessly at the lifeless form of his captain, the one man he looked up to. What on earth did just happen? This felt so surreal. Hadn't Luffy just been jumping up and down and running around, all the way laughing like a maniac? Hadn't he moved freely, beating the Marine soldiers with his endless source of energy? Chopper could hardly believe the picture his eyes were sending to his brain. This was not how it was supposed to work. Luffy was not supposed to look so pale, so much like a human. Luffy was supposed to be invulnerable. Luffy was supposed to be Luffy. As if someone had pushed a button, the Marine snapped out of it. Finally, the enemy began to understand this wasn't just some kind of game the pirates played and hell broke loose. They grinned confidently and rushed towards the crew with new fighting spirit, screaming all the way with swords raised. Ha! 1 down, 8 to follow. One of them shouted, the bloodlust and hatred glistening in his eyes. We beat the infamous son of Dragon. We can beat the rest of his crew, too. Lieutenant Hale, a short man with chubby cheeks, smiled maliciously as he saw Luffy was indeed not getting up again. Quickly, he turned to stand in the soldiers' way. Hold on, men. Focus on Strafut Luffy, he's our prey. I want him dead or alive, now is your chance. Arrest him first. Yes sir. They shouted in perfect unison and rushed to their prey. Zoro cursed under his breath as people started to run after Luffy, shouting wildly. He didn't hesitate to join the chaos, trying to reach Luffy first but things were getting out of control too fast. A minute before the Straw Hats had clearly had the upper hand, but suddenly the tide had turned and their, just for fun, fight turned out to be deadly serious. The swordsman cursed again. Those Marine people seemed to have lost their heads. They were trying to charge at his captain, his blanching, unmoving, unconscious captain, and Zoro instantly knew he couldn't reach him fast enough. He absent-mindedly slashed 3 guys with 1 sword, searching for his nakama in this mess. Where the heck were they all of a sudden? Weren't they right behind him a second ago? Oi, someone grab Luffy, we have to get out of here. Zoro shouted, hoping the others would hear him. They had to get back to the Sunny as quick as possible and have Luffy checked. Something told Zoro that this time shit really hit the fan. I got Strafut. He's out cold. A voice suddenly shouted, and immediately Zoro's head whipped up at that. This didn't come from one of the Straw Hats, Zoro could easily tell. What? Damn it, he thought and shot around, trying to find the person whom the voice belonged to. If only he could make Luffy out in this huge mess of screaming people. But it was nearly impossible. The Marine fighters seemed twice as much as before. Zoro felt like searching for a sugar cube in the middle of an anthill, the only difference was that these greedy Marines wouldn't actually eat his captain. They'd do much worse things to him. Crap, Zoro shouted and decided to let his instincts take control over him. Meaning, he closed his eyes, bowed his head and began to cut his way through this mass of noisy Marines, not letting panic or any other emotion get in the way. Lieutenant Hale, who had yet to recognize the danger he was in, grinned upon seeing one of his men carrying Luffy away from the others and opened his arms as if to embrace him. Great work, he praised loudly, but it sounded like a shrieking madman. His eyes wide, a huge grin upon his face, the lieutenant opened his mouth to let the world know of his victory, but unfortunately Roronoa Zoro was faster. The demon swordsman slashed him before he had time to comprehend what was happening. Lieutenant Hale was dead before he hit the dusty ground. Now that his main target was finished, Zoro turned around to the huge mass of Marines behind him. Those guys obviously hadn't noticed their leader was dead, seeing as they were still running around and fighting as crazy. The first mate of the Straw Hats lifted his swords and he narrowed his gaze. His eyes darted around too quick for anyone to follow, only one thought occupying his mind. Where is he? If Zoro could, he would have sent them all to hell with a simple onigiri. But he would risk hurting one of his friends, so his stronger attacks were out of questions. He had no other choice but searching for Luffy and the rest of the crew step by step, victim by victim. Just as he was about to cut someone's chest open, a familiar voice made him stop in his tracks. Frankie's loud, almost calm voice cut through the air like thunder. For once he didn't add a super. Oi, I got Luffy, let's go everyone. Zoro allowed a small sigh of relief escape his lips before he made his way back to where Frankie had to be. Quickly, he spotted the rest of the crew and sighed in relief for the second time that day. Where the hell have they been all the time? But Zoro forgot his anger immediately when he saw his captain. Luffy was out cold and was dropped over Frankie's shoulder, unresponsive. It was grotesque, but the black-haired boy looked like an old rag doll. It made the swordsman's stomach turn upside down. As they all reunited in the middle of that chaos, with numerous wild Marines on their heels, they broke through everything and everyone that dared to stand in their way and fled to the Thousand Sunny, choosing not to fight for once. The captain's health was their first priority. What the deuce was that? Sanji gasped out while running. Something like this had never happened before, it came totally unexpected. If someone had told Sanji that Luffy would just faint like that he would have laughed his ass off. Now he certainly didn't feel like laughing as he watched Luffy's fingers limply dangling from Frankie's back. It was a bizarre sight and he quickly turned his head away. Hell if I knew. Zoro responded darkly. Chopper sniffled behind him, trying hard not to cry. But it had been a huge shock to see Luffy crashing to the ground out of the blue and he couldn't help but feel guilty for not preventing that. I can't believe this. Nami stuttered, clearly shaken by the events. Tell me about it. I wonder what's wrong with Luffy, Usopp said, panting from all the running. Just as Nami was about to answer, Frankie interrupted. Oi, Minna, I think we can discuss it all in peace once we're on Thousand Sunny. But until then, shut up and concentrate on running. Frankie's right, let's save the talking for later. Zoro said, and no one objected. YXYXYXYXYXYXYX. As they reached the harbor minutes later, they didn't waste a second and hopped aboard. Frankie immediately brought Luffy into the infirmary, closely followed by Chopper who began to examine him. The rest of the crew got ready and set sail instantly, only focusing on getting away from the island. As the Thousand Sunny sailed away, slowly but steadily, the crew gathered in the kitchen to wait for Chopper's diagnosis. They were all worried and still quite shocked about the day's events, none of them thought it would turn out this way. It had been so sudden. Today sure was something else. It scared me a lot when Luffy-san collapsed. I thought my heart would stop. But then, I don't have, Brook began, but Nami slapped the poor skeleton over the head, shutting him up. No time for bad jokes, Brook. I'm sorry. I know he's supposed to be really strong now and all, but still I'm worried. I sure hope he's okay, Usopp sighed, not looking anyone in the eye. They all sat at the table, trying hard not to let the tensed silence win over. It was really weird how one single person could change the mood of 8 people so quickly. But it only showed how much they cared for Luffy. We all hope that, dude. Frankie commented dryly, playing with his bottle of cola but not taking a sip of it. Yeah, I can't imagine what it would be like to have dinner without him. I mean, I only would have to cook half of the usual amount. Sanji half joked and made the others chuckle slightly. Even Zoro had to snort at that. Robin nodded. It's true, without Captain San everyone could actually eat from their own plate without having to worry someone's going to steal it. Now that'd be rather boring, wouldn't it? Nami smiled but it soon faded. Indeed, Brook nodded. Then, another awkward silence settled in as each of them drifted off in thoughts. But no one could stand the deafening quiet for too long, so they decided to keep their minds occupied with playing cards while chatting about this and that. Later, Sanji was cooking dinner, a welcome distraction, when Chopper suddenly stepped into the kitchen, face down. Immediately, everyone stopped what they were doing and looked at the doctor in tense anticipation. So, what is it, Chopper? Did our captain catch a cold from the last unintentional bath he took? Nami said, smiling down at the reindeer. Or is it the flu? Usopp had to smile, too, because he remembered Luffy's last, unintentional bath, as well.
Yo, quick pause, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here, share this video, and tell me in the comments which part you're loving the most.
Though his happiness was cut short when Chopper lifted his head to reveal a tear-stained face. Quote. Chopper, Sanji said, frowning. Chopper sobbed harshly, gulping. I don't know. Chapter 3 Terrifying. 2 days passed without Luffy showing any signs of getting better. Instead, the Strafut captain grew worse each minute. The crew hardly wanted to believe how weak their leader looked. It had all happened so incredibly fast. A few days ago, everything had been just fine. He'd been running around, laughing loudly, and now he could barely breathe on his own. How come all their happiness had been shattered so quickly? As the Straw Hats were gathered in the infirmary, Chopper told them about the many symptoms and how he couldn't find a fitting sickness for them. The poor reindeer had spent hours of searching his medicine books, but he just couldn't find what he was looking for. He thought Doctrine had taught him everything she knew, but apparently that hadn't been enough. That thought frustrated and scared Chopper at the same time. How was he supposed to meet everyone's expectations as a good doctor if he couldn't cure Luffy? And what if Luffy really died? You still don't know what sickness he has. Usopp didn't mean to shout, but he was so shocked it just slipped out like that. Usually, Nami would have whacked him for being so noisy, but she was trying to process the bad news. Shish, not so loud, Usopp. Chopper barked, but quickly went back to his desperate expression. Why yeah, I don't know what I should do anymore. He just won't get better no matter what I try. I actually fear for his life. He sniffled and looked at the others as if they would tell him what to do. But of course that was foolish, none of them had an idea of how to handle this. Shocked faces stared at their youngest member as if waiting for him to tell them it was all just a terrible joke. But Chopper didn't start laughing, quite the reverse was the case. Chopper, Nami put her hands over her mouth, near tears. Luffy won't die that easily. Zoro's deep, calming voice cut through the air like a knife. The others turned to look at the unofficial first mate. Zoro stood in the middle of the room like a rock that could not be removed, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He's our captain, right? I bet he's going to raid the kitchen tonight after having so little to eat all the time. The comment made some of them chuckle slightly. He'll be up before you know it. Luffy's always been a ridiculous fast healer after all. Zoro finished and stared at Luffy for a moment as if to wait for him to jump out of bed, whining about food. A second later he went out of the infirmary without another word. What's wrong with that idiot? Nami shook her head after Zoro was out of the room, rubbing her nose. Sanji agreed, scratching the back of his head. That damn Marimo. I can't believe he's so blindly trusting. I know what you mean. It's not like I don't believe Luffy bro isn't strong enough or anything, but this sickness is something we should take seriously. Frankie said, watching how their captain frowned in his sleep. It was almost as if he could feel the tensed atmosphere around him. Perhaps Zoro-san is just trying to hide how upset he is. Robin suggested and nodded towards the window. Sanji frowned and, for once not reacting oddly to a beautiful woman, took a look out of the window. What do you mean, Robin Kwan? Oh, I see. What he saw made him sigh deeply. Zoro was training like a madman, sweat running down his naked upper body already. There was a deep frown upon his face that made him appear years older. Everyone knew what this sight meant and it was quite sad. Zoro was forcing himself to forget everything and everyone around him in favor of not having to worry about Luffy anymore. Quote. That dumb Marimo. Sanji bit his lip. Hey, guys, Chopper piped up timidly, catching the others' attention. Zoro's right, isn't he? Luffy's stronger than this sickness, right? Usopp forced a grin and stepped over to where Chopper stood beside Luffy's bed. Haha, what are you talking about? Of course our first mate is right. Since when had Luffy ever let us down, huh? Right, never. And he won't start now. Chopper smiled a bit after hearing this. If Usopp said so, then it had to be true. Yes, you're so wise, Usopp. The sniper grinned, the rest of the crew just rolled their eyes upon the obvious admiration. Why yes of course I am. Don't worry, Dr. Chopper. I'm sure no matter what kind of sickness Luffy has, you'll be able to help him. That shithead is right, Chopper. You're gonna cure him like always and everything will be fine. Sanji threw in a comment, smirking all the way as he casually put his hands into his pockets. Usopp frowned at the nickname, but didn't reply. Chopper danced at the praise, grinning in embarrassment. The others just chuckled half-heartedly at the scene, save for Robin who sighed at the weak attempt of the crew to lighten the mood. They weren't any better than Zoro the way they tried to act as normal as possible. But telling them about this would just complicate things, so Robin decided to keep her mouth shut for now. A little good humor wasn't so bad, even if it was fake. Usopp patted Chopper's head, smiling. Sanji's right, we have the best doctor in the crew, after all. Besides, look at him. At that, Usopp pointed at the sleeping Luffy. He's our captain, there's no way he's going to lose to that fever. The moment those words left his mouth, Luffy coughed in his sleep. His nakama were looking at the bed, and as if reality had just hit them they couldn't say a word anymore. All the small smiles were wiped from their faces. They just noticed how pale Luffy still was, except for the dark flush on his cheeks from the high fever. And now that it was completely still in the room, everyone could hear the ragged breathing. It was obvious that Luffy had trouble inhaling. The crew exchanged concerned glances, the mood dropping a few degrees. Chopper gulped and Usopp didn't want to look at his sick captain anymore and stared at the floor instead, scratching his arm awkwardly. He'd just meant to cheer the reindeer up, but thanks to him everyone was even more worried than before. Brook would have frowned if he was able to. He wanted to make a joke, but found he had no energy to do so. He grimly walked over to Luffy's bed and took a chair beside him. Sanji mimicked his actions and sat on the end of the bed, hands still in his pockets. The silence was threatening to squash them as realization settled in slowly. Looking at him in such a weak state made them see the truth. Luffy had come out of so many dangerous, life-threatening situations unharmed that they just started to think of him differently. How many times had they thought, feared, that this time they'd lose him? How many times had he proved them it was foolish to fear for his life, because he always found a way to survive somehow? They had gotten used to Luffy's countless reckless actions, that's why they just stopped worrying for him all the time. He was Luffy, the man who declared war to the world and all the foes of freedom, the one boy who had risked his own life without thinking twice for people he held dear, the Luffy who was stronger than anyone, maybe not physically but by heart and will. Somewhere in the back of their heads, the Straw Hats still knew that every living creature was vulnerable in a way and Luffy was no expectation. He was human like them, capable of dying, yes. But it just never occurred to them that Luffy would be on the brink of death without returning to them. They just hadn't accepted the possibility of their captain dying. They had all forgotten, but Luffy wasn't inviolable. Because in the end, he was just a young boy who had lost so much and suffered more than anyone deserved. Right now, Luffy was just a lad who was fighting for his life with anything he had, trying hard to stay positive and keep on breathing. One by one, the rest of the crew left the infirmary. They couldn't bear watching Luffy struggle to breathe and wanted to keep their minds occupied with different things. Sanji went into the kitchen to prepare the dinner, Frankie wanted to repair an old machine of his, Robin and Chopper headed into the library to do some research, Brook sat on deck and played a slow tune. Only Nami stayed back since someone had to be watching Luffy in case something happened. As she sat beside his bed, numerous thoughts and memories floated through her mind and she had to bite her lip hard not to cry. It was unbelievable how someone so powerful could be so weakened all of a sudden by a sickness. Nami absent-mindedly pushed a strand of hair out of Luffy's face, looking at him with eyes full of affection. Luffy always tried so hard to make each of his nakama happy, and look what he got in return. It wasn't fair, but Nami didn't want to complain about it. Life had never been fair, she'd learned that lesson when she was a little kid. A harsh cough rattled through Luffy's body, but he still didn't wake up. Nami breathed a tired sigh as she exchanged the wet cloth on his forehead. It was hard to watch Luffy fighting without being able to help. No, it was unbearable. His nakama were forced to watch how he was fighting against an invisible, horrible enemy that loved to see people suffer. It's called fate. There was always a malicious grin upon its face. And it was overly happy as it saw the big, salty drops of water running down Nami's soft cheeks. They dripped onto her forearms and hands that shook uncontrollably. She couldn't help it, it looked so horrible how her strong captain lay there suffering in that bed. This wasn't her captain, the Luffy she knew, it was a dying person. Luffy, she whispered although she knew he probably couldn't hear her. Nami lifted her shaking hand and reached forward to caress his cheek. A harsh sob escaped her throat as she felt the immense heat radiating off him, the fever was still rising. Please don't leave us. Of course, the sleeping boy didn't answer, but then, Nami hadn't really expected a reaction. She'd only hoped for one. As Chopper came in 15 minutes later to check on his patient, he wasn't surprised to find Nami fast asleep beside his bed. She had her head next to his shoulder and was holding his hand. He didn't want to destroy that moment of peace since Nami and even Luffy looked comfortable and somewhat at ease like this. So instead of waking the navigator, Chopper placed a blanket over her and took a seat at Luffy's other side, just watching his two nakama sleep. It was silent in the sick bay. Right now, nothing was happening. Anyone would say it was outright boring to watch someone else sleep, but Chopper thought this sight was actually really nice. It was nice to close his eyes and listen to that slow, deep inhaling and exhaling of his friends who matched their breathing perfectly, almost as if they had never done anything else. It was a moment full of harmony just between friends. Chopper sniveled silently. The reindeer wished this could last forever, even though he knew it was terribly wrong to ask for something like that. YXYXYXYXYXYXYXYX. At night, the crew sat together in an eerie silence. Each of them tried not to look at the empty seat that left a huge gap between them. But it was painfully obvious that Luffy was not present. Of course, it's not like they had never had a meal without their captain. There had been numerous times they had eaten with Luffy missing it. How many times had Luffy been unconscious for a day or two after a battle? It's been too often to count already, it was nothing new. Though this time, it was entirely different. This time, they were actually scared their captain would never sit at the table eating with them again. Not only was it awfully quiet, but also the fact that the whole atmosphere was way too depressing and dark made it hard to stay positive. This incident had thrown them all off balance. There was a tensed silence in the kitchen. None of the crew was hungry and felt like eating at the moment. It just didn't seem right to sit there together while Luffy was down in the infirmary, fighting his high fever. Chopper was with him, keeping a watchful eye over their captain, but still they felt like they should go down and help Luffy fighting his battle. There had to be something they could do other than sitting around, acting as if nothing was wrong. Usopp stared at his plate that was filled with hot spaghetti. Even though Sanji's cooking was lacking its usual perfection, it still looked like a work of art the way he'd prepared it. It looked absolutely delicious and almost too good to just eat it. Still, Usopp would give a lot to have Luffy's rubber hand crashing into the spaghetti, snatching the meal away. Speaking of Sanji, the cook just didn't have the same energy and enthusiasm about cooking anymore, everyone had noticed. His meals tasted fine, yes, but different. Maybe it was because they didn't taste perfect anymore. There was something important missing. It's only been 2 days since their captain's unexpected illness, but it already had such a huge impact on everyone. The truth hurt, but without Luffy around, Sanji didn't cook as passionately as before anymore. Brook took a sip of his tea. It was funny, he'd spent 50 years, half a century, all on his own in complete darkness, and he knew better than anyone how cruel time could be. Still, he was quite shocked to learn it had just been 2 days since Luffy's collapse. Those past 2 days had stretched like years and reminded Brook so much of his time in the fog. How could 2 days be so damn long? He also wasn't joking around anymore. They wouldn't admit it out loud, but they all missed the guy's terrible skull jokes badly. It was shocking how dead Brook looked when he didn't laugh or tell jokes. The Straw Hats had never looked at Brook like that, they'd always regarded him as one of them, a living, smiling, breathing human being. But right now, he was so different from what he used to be. He looked like a lifeless, wandering skeleton with ghastly, hollow eye sockets. Frankie wasn't any better. Though he always told himself that there was still a chance Luffy would survive, it never lifted his spirits. Why were they all so depressed suddenly? Luffy was still alive, wasn't he? Still, the cyborg had changed. He even stopped saying the word, super. It was a minor detail, but his friends thought it was awful. To them it made a huge difference. That tiny, annoying word was part of whom Frankie was, part of his very personality. Now this part was gone, and instead a more aggressive Frankie had surfaced. He'd unintentionally snap at his nakama, almost constantly being in a bad mood. It was hard to compare him to the flower shirt wearing Frankie they'd come to like so much. Since Luffy had fallen ill, Robin was even more quiet and thoughtful than usually. Nami thought she was the only one who had noticed, but Sanji and Zoro saw it as well. Wherever Robin went, a dark shadow was looming behind her. She seemed to transform back into her old, withdrawn self with ocean blue eyes full of sadness instead of freedom. Nami could barely stand watching it, but she just didn't have the strength and optimism to cheer Robin up. Actually, Nami was worse than Robin. The orange-haired girl cried a lot, even though she hated weeping. It was not only a sign of weakness but also showed that she didn't believe in their captain's strength. Was she really that hopeless? Did she really give up on Luffy already? Nami bit her lip as new tears threatened to roll down her face again. Her beautiful eyes were bloodshot and dark circles underneath them told the others of the many sleepless nights she spent crying. She could only think of that grinning face of her captain, bright eyes full of earnest happiness. Nami was terribly scared she wouldn't be able to see Luffy's blinding smile again. And Zoro. Zoro was silent. He was strong, emotionless, stoic. Never angry, never seen crying. He was only training madly, stubbornly focusing on growing stronger and stronger. He missed the fact that he unconsciously began to build a barrier around himself. No one could go through that and see what's behind. He was locking them all out. Sometimes, it made the others feel as if Zoro didn't care, but that was bullshit because it probably hurt him most what was happening to Luffy. The other Nakama couldn't think of Luffy without Zoro somewhere around the boy. As long as they could think back, they had never seen Luffy being alone. The green-haired swordsman had always been around. Of course, that led to a misunderstanding to outsiders. Some began to think Zoro were the captain, others may think Zoro was like an attachment to Luffy, like his bodyguard, following each of his steps. Though, truth be told, Luffy didn't need a bodyguard or an attachment. He needed someone he could always rely on and who would support him no matter what. He needed a true friend who helped him take the first step towards his dream. To make it short, someone like Zoro. Those two had shaped their pirate crew. They had been the first two people of the Strafut group. Those two were the base, the cadre, the foundation stone of the crew. But right now, their foundation was cracked. And that was what made Zoro's resolve break finally. It was unbearable, the depressed atmosphere that was looming all over the ship, the sadness and irritation you could clearly see on everyone's face. It was too much. Luffy would be shocked if he knew how much they had all changed in such short amount of time. This wasn't his crew anymore, he wouldn't recognize any of them. So, as they sat there in the kitchen, each of them lost in thoughts, Zoro couldn't take it anymore. He grit his teeth, and let his hidden anger out at once, as he suddenly barked loudly at his friends. "What's wrong with you? Why the hell are you acting as if he's already gone? He's Luffy, for God's sake. He won't die from a fucking sickness. He'll become the king of pirates, before that he doesn't have time for dying." Zoro all but shouted. "Oi, Zoro," Sanji snapped, but Zoro cut him off. "Have you no faith in Luffy?" he asked, leaving a thick silence as everyone just stared at him in shock. How could Zoro even suggest such a thing? Suddenly, the silence was broken by the navigator as she snorted humorlessly, drawing everyone's attention towards her. Slowly, Nami rose from her seat, eyes shaded by her hair. She inhaled deeply to keep her composure and then turned to glare at Zoro. "Have you lost it, Zoro?" she asked calmly. The rest of the crew members frowned but chose not to interfere. The first mate rose one brow, glaring right back. "Nani, what the hell?" With a loud crash, Nami sent her fists down onto the table. Hard. The sudden noise made the others flinch and even Zoro shut his mouth quickly. "Have you lost it?" she repeated, this time screaming loudly. "What the fuck are you talking about? Of course we have faith in him, and you know better than to question our loyalty towards Luffy." "You," Zoro began, but Nami slammed her hands down again, effectively silencing him. "Shut it, I'm not finished. What do you mean with Luffy won't die from something silly like a sickness? He still hasn't become the Pirate King yet, after all. Cut the crap." No one dared to comment on that. They all just watched, gaping, as Nami took another deep breath and continued in her rage. "What the hell kind of reasoning is that? I know that we have to believe in him, but there's a huge difference between believing and denying. And just in case you forgot, Luffy is still human. Right now, Luffy is very sick, you can deny it all you want, but he is on the verge of death. Open your eyes, Zoro, don't pretend to be so blind. Just, don't make it worse than it already is." She spoke the last part in a whisper and began to sob quietly, furiously rubbing at her eyes. Nami's outburst made Frankie weep silently, too, and he reached forward to pat the navigator's head in a comforting manner. Zoro, looking rather taken aback at first, opened his mouth to say something in return, but he decided against it. Instead, he turned around and stomped out of the kitchen, slamming the door loudly. The others looked at the damaged door solemnly, unsure how to comment on that. He looked quite helpless. And that's how they all felt, helpless. Brook made an attempt to follow the swordsman, but a hand spread out from the table and stopped him gently. As the musician looked at Robin, he was surprised to find tears in her eyes as she shook her head sadly, looking back at Brook. The skeleton gulped and forced himself to sit back down, fingering quietly with his right sleeve. After that, the awkward atmosphere in the kitchen was absolute. No one talked, the only noise being made was Nami's and Frankie's silent weeping. Most of them stared into nothing as they all began to ponder about what Nami had said. In the end, they all knew she was right, they were trying to deny their situation. Running away wouldn't solve anything. On the other hand, what good would it do to face what was about to come? Luffy wouldn't get any better even if they acted more prepared, anyways, right? Acting so clueless helped them to keep their composure, albeit they knew it was wrong to pretend false hope. But even though they tried by any means possible to believe everything would be fine in the end, something was missing. It was lost and they all feared it wouldn't be found again. How did this happen? They thought they were more than a crew, more than just friends. They thought their trust was deeper than anything. But the small argument earlier just showed them that their bond wasn't as strong as they believed it to be. But maybe it was because they all sensed this was something really big, something deadly serious. Something that would change them, or maybe not, who would know? They just knew that apparently, this was just the beginning. Because slowly, they were breaking apart. Each of them was busy pitying themselves. And who could blame them? The possibility of Luffy dying was absolutely terrifying. Chapter 4. It was a stormy night. Anyone can give up, it's the easiest thing in the world to do. But to hold it together when everyone else would understand if you fell apart, that's true strength. Zoro stormed out of the kitchen. Had that really just happened? Nami had shouted at him, everyone had watched in shock, and he'd acted like a stubborn, little child. He, Roronoa Zoro, the demonic fighter, the stoic swordsman, the immature kid. But the worst part was that he hadn't been able to get his point across, to get them out of their small, dark space. The crew was still as depressed as before. Maybe even more thanks to him now. Zoro was embarrassed and mad and really disappointed. In whom? In the crew? In Luffy? In himself? He didn't know. There were so many emotions dwelling up inside his chest he could barely contain himself. Zoro wasn't used to being so sensitive and moody. Since when did he act like a girl with messed up hormones? As he stomped on the grassy deck, he stumbled a bit and he had to lean on the mast not to fall down. For a moment, Zoro closed his eyes shut to prevent throwing up right here and there. The rain was pouring down on him, but he was numb to the coldness around him. How on earth did he lose control like that in the kitchen? Zoro had thought he could contain his feelings locked inside him. He didn't want to show this kind of Zoro to the others, but now it was too late. The swordsman felt so ashamed. He wished he would have behaved wiser and calmer back then, more Zoro-like. Luffy had chosen him because he was cool-headed. Now look at what that cool-headed guy did. Zoro sighed tiredly. He hadn't intended to burst like that. He'd wanted to state a calm but stern and unmistakably announcement to shake them out of their torpid state. His thoughts whirled through his head and mixed up everything like a tornado. Zoro gritted his teeth angrily, his rage suddenly getting the better of him. Damn that thick silence, damn that witch and the damned love cook, damn the others. Damn it, Luffy, Zoro suddenly shouted, hitting the mast hard enough to leave a 3 inches deep hole in it. The swordsman slid to the ground. Suddenly, he felt very exhausted. He massaged his temples and took in deep breaths. Inhale, exhale, exhale. He told himself, slowly and steadily. Just get a hold of yourself, goddammit. He was the unofficial first mate. He should tell them not to worry so much, to maintain their lively and heartily spirit, to cheer Luffy on. He should give them the courage they needed so desperately. Why had it become so hard to spread some happiness all of a sudden? Their ship had seemed like a damn kindergarten full of laughing little kids a few days ago, just until. That's right, until Luffy had fallen sick. Zoro slapped his hands over his eye and clenched it shut. He felt so useless. Hadn't he lost enough of his dignity already? Nothing could stop his emotions, not even the immense strong feeling of discomposure. Damn you, Luffy, he repeated, growling like a beast, making me cry like a weakling. It was the first time since he got defeated by Mihawk that Zoro actually wept. Later on, he'd be as quiet as a gravestone about the whole matter, though for now he decided even strong men were allowed to cry. But only this time, and only for him. YXYXYXYXYXYXYXYXYX. They were sitting in the kitchen when it suddenly happened. Chopper, who'd been watching Luffy until a while ago, had come up to get something to drink. Zoro was still outside, not bothered the least by the cool rain and the thunder. Chopper had spotted the quiet swordsman leaning against the mast, obviously asleep. The doctor wanted to tell him to get in before he got sick, too, but Zoro's unusual threatening aura had kept him away successfully. Chopper sighed sadly and pushed the kitchen door open. Robin and Sanji offered him a small, tired smile and he smiled back, but soon it faded. The others either didn't notice him or were just too lost in their own thoughts to actually greet, but Chopper wasn't so surprised by this. Things had been so depressing lately, how he wished everything would change back to how it used to be. He shook his furry head quickly. Right now, the little Zoan just couldn't afford these kind of thoughts. It was extremely important for him, as the ship's only doctor, to focus on his patient. Guiding his thoughts back to Luffy, he began to quicken his steps. Chopper had to hurry, he couldn't afford to leave his captain alone for long. He knew that Luffy was very weak and hadn't even woken up since his collapse. But if anything, the Strafut captain was known for his talent to surprise people, even those who'd known him for a long time. That and the fact that Luffy's breathing worried him made Chopper walk faster. Though, apparently luck wasn't on his side. He wasn't quick enough. Even if the reindeer barely took 2 minutes, Luffy had actually managed to sneak out of the infirmary in that short amount of time. No one had noticed. Ixi. A figure stepped onto the deck, wobbling on unsteady legs as if he were drunk. If Zoro weren't focused on himself that much he would have realized the other person's presence immediately. As he was now, however, shocked and irritated about his own sudden emotional outburst, he didn't even hear the steps nearing him. Luffy reeled around, feeling completely disorientated, and touched his forehead as a sudden spell of dizziness hit him. Groaning and blinking, he couldn't help but wonder where all the water was coming from. Wasn't he inside? How come it was so wet and dark everywhere? The tired groan alerted Zoro and pushed him out of his dazed state. He jerked around in one movement, jumping up. He was ready to pull out his sword but froze upon seeing none other than Luffy, the last person he'd expected to see. He blanched visibly. What the Luffy? Disclaimer: this story do not belong to me. The author is A Case of Identity by Nako 11 inches. Luffy's hand fell limply back to his side as he blinked at his first mate. Huh. The look Luffy gave Zoro was surprised. No, that wasn't the right word. Luffy regarded the swordsman with a look of pure wonder, as if he had just seen Zoro for the first time in his entire life. Which was a ridiculous thought since the Strafut boy and Zoro had known each other for the longest time. Zoro hid the sudden urge to just stare and sort out his thoughts and whether he should feel relieved or terrified. Deciding that the latter was the more logical consequence, he cleared his throat and quickly stepped forward towards his captain. Luffy shouldn't be here outside with him. Heck, for all he knew, the boy was in a horrible condition and shouldn't even be awake. Luffy, are you okay? Can you hear me? What on earth are you doing on deck? He asked as gently as possible. The A-dressed boy didn't answer right away, instead he continued to look at Zoro in a strange way. The older man suddenly scrunched his brows together in obvious concern. At first he hadn't noticed, but now that he was taking a more critical look at his friend, Zoro realized Luffy didn't exactly look at him. His glassy eyes seemed to bore right through him, wandering around in a land that didn't exist. The 19-years-old face looked hollow and so foreign it gave Zoro the chills. Damn it, was all that shot through Zoro's head. As if the outburst in the kitchen earlier hadn't been enough. Now he had to be confronted with his very sick and very out-of-character acting captain. That was a little too much for one day, even for someone as strong as Zoro. What was he supposed to do? Did Luffy even see him? In truth, the other hadn't really noticed Zoro was there. The Strafut boy didn't even know where he was or what was going on. He'd just woken a minute before from a horrible nightmare to find himself in a strange place, trapped in a sweating body that hurt all over. He'd dreamt about a young man with freckles, a special someone he'd always recognize everywhere. Ace. It had been a terrifying and pretty scary dream and Luffy wasn't sure whether it had really happened after all. The battle. Ace dying. All the people screaming. The blood. The Strafut boy wasn't sure if he wanted to find out the truth. Actually, it was all so dizzying. He groaned miserably. Feeling more than just terrible, his stomach did strange flips and he nearly puked into his bed but managed to force it back down. Luffy was confused and so tired it was really hard not to let his eyes slip close again. He couldn't remember what had happened for him to end up like this even if his life depended on it, which was ironic, since it was really on the line this time. Not sure why he wanted so badly to get out of this room, Luffy somehow managed to half crawl, half stumble on deck, following his instincts to get out of this dark place of loneliness. Because that's what he felt, lonely. He needed to get away from this depressing atmosphere in this room. Where were the others? Luffy could have sworn he'd been traveling with some people, his friends, hadn't he? What had happened? Why on earth wasn't he feeling hungry? He always felt hungry. Was he even on his ship or was he in Fuchsia village? Where was Makino? Thousands of questions shot through his mind like a rain of meteors, but soon they were forgotten in favor of focusing on moving his legs forward. In the end he didn't really care since thinking only made his terrible sight and awful pounding headache much worse. He couldn't really sort out anything well and just made his way ahead, not even feeling the ice-cold rain and the strong wind. Then suddenly, something had appeared before him. It was just slightly bigger than him, the thing. For a short amount of time Luffy felt as if he should know this whatever it was, this stinging feeling that told him there was more than a silhouette before him. But as soon as it had appeared, the thought was blown away by the wind the next second and long gone before Luffy could even grasp that tiny glimpse. There was a noise and it came from the thing before him, a strange gurgling noise. Was he supposed to answer or something? Luffy hoped not, his tongue seemed really tired and his jaw wasn't acting as he wanted it to. Without warning, Luffy's eyes slipped close, only to shoot open a second later again. He felt too weird, so very dizzy and everything was hurting. The most disturbing thing however was that Luffy couldn't decide if he was hot or freezing. His skin felt cold and he was shaking like a leaf in the wind, but on the other hand his head felt as if it would split in two any moment from all the heat inside him and he was sweating up a storm. As his confusing thoughts drifted around, Luffy couldn't help but wonder if it was even possible for a human being to feel warm and cold at the very same time. Not that he had ever paid much heed to his body's warning signals before, but this time it was different. Everything was different, his perception was blurry and colors mixed together wildly, his hearing was off. He was sure it was quite noisy around him but it all sounded so far away, and his balance was messed up the worst. The rubber man could barely manage to stand upright. Zoro had noticed this right away, it was hard to overlook even in the dark, really, and positioned himself near Luffy with his arms slightly opened up, just in case the younger one should collapse. Which Luffy looked ready for and Zoro wouldn't be surprised if that would happen the next second. Zoro didn't know what to make of this. Actually, he'd figured out why Luffy was acting so strangely and didn't even try to respond to him, but the truth was so ugly Zoro didn't want to believe it. It couldn't be. Did Luffy really not recognize him? It was shocking and unbelievable sad at the same time, and the tough swordsman felt ready to cry for the second time this day. The older man quickly got a hold of himself however, he knew it wouldn't help anyone if he had an emotional breakdown right now. Luffy needed him more than ever, and Zoro needed to do something. Where the fuck was Chopper? Luffy. Hey, Luffy, look at me. Hey. Zoro decided to try and talk to him again. Obviously, Luffy was delirious and didn't even quite understand where he was, so maybe it was good to let him know he wasn't alone. Even if Luffy didn't know the person before him at the moment. Slowly, because Zoro didn't want to scare Luffy away or confuse him with two quick movements he hadn't expected, the swordsman stepped closer to where his captain stood on shaky legs. Luffy's white oversized nightshirt, Zoro noticed with a sharp intake of breath that it was one of his old ones, was completely drenched by rain in no time and the first mate could imagine healthier things for a sick boy. Unbelievable how this was the same Luffy who invaded into Impel Down and fought so hard at the battlefield 2 years ago, trying to save his brother. Right now, he was a rather pathetic sight but Zoro knew better than to call his leader pathetic. Luffy was the only man he'd bow to and that meant a lot. Roronoa Zoro was not someone who got impressed easily. Luffy voiced again, still not quite there. There it was again, the strange gurgling sound from the weird shadow before him. If only he could catch the spoken vocals. Luffy frowned tiredly. Zoro sensed this was leading nowhere and opted it was best to bring him straight back to bed. Now, he'd wasted enough time as it was already, and trying to get through that hazy fog around his captain's brain was a futile attempt. Alright, Zoro sighed almost sadly and reached out to grab the pale boy. To his surprise, he grabbed nothing but thin air. He looked up instantly and realized Luffy had managed to flinch back even in his weakened state. And suddenly, Zoro knew this would be much more difficult than he first thought. There seemed to be a tensed air around the Strafoot boy and his stance practically screamed defense. Against whom? His own first mate and best friend. Apparently so. Luffy, come on. Stop this crap. Don't make this matter more complicated than it already is. You need to get back inside. Right, now. Zoro barked angrily. He hadn't meant for it to sound so harsh, but he needed to make Luffy understand this was serious. Unfortunately, Luffy didn't take the well-meant advice the right way. Quite the opposite was the case. Since Luffy's hearing wasn't working so well, he only sensed a change in aura around the strange guy in front of him and got into defensiveness mode. Get away, Luffy growled in a low voice. It made his sore throat hurt like hell, but at the moment he didn't care. This man meant business, and right now, Luffy didn't want any unnecessary clash. He felt too powerless to fight, let alone stand on his own feet. The hell, cut it out already. It's me, Zoro. The green-haired man snarled back and stepped closer. If this stupid, stubborn, sick kid didn't listen to him, then he had no other choice as to force him back inside. There was no way Luffy would stand a chance against Zoro right now, and Zoro wasn't afraid to use violence if it was needed. He'd rather have Luffy get a few bruises that would with no doubt heal in one day than have his fever getting worse. What are you trying to do, jerk? Where is everyone? Luffy demanded angrily, voice getting hoarse from the effort of raising his voice. Zoro wanted to respond but was attacked by an aimless Gomu Gomu no pistol that missed his head by 10 inches. Zoro grumbled, this was getting out of hand too fast. Luffy's arm snapped back into place and nearly knocked him over, but surprisingly he managed to catch himself. Immediately, the captain prepared for another attack and extended both arms behind his back. Zoro recognized the familiar pose and knew what was about to come. Gomu Gomu no Baz. Oh no, you don't. The swordsman jumped forward so fast Luffy could barely follow his movements and he had no time to react. The next moment he felt his arms being grabbed in an iron grip he could not escape, no matter how much he struggled. Let me go. I'm gonna kick your ass. Luffy shouted and moved around in vain. Zoro's grip hardened a bit and he frowned in concern. The 21-year-old could feel the immense heat radiating off Luffy's skin. It was a miracle the captain hadn't collapsed up until now. Hold still. Luffy, hey, listen to me. Wake up. You need to get in. See, hey. It was useless. Luffy continued to fight against an enemy that was his best friend. He didn't know, all he knew was that this guy was way too strong. Luffy could do nothing. He was such a weakling. A sudden feeling of all too familiar helplessness shot through him and he gasped. No, let go of me, no. Dread filled his stomach and Luffy was appalled by the pictures of a dead ace that flooded his mind. The swordsman hadn't expected to receive such a strong reaction and flinched just a tiny bit. However this person was, it was certainly not Luffy. Zoro thought it was atrocious what a sickness could do to a human. Luffy was on the edge of panic. Shit, Luffy, calm down. Would you look at me for a moment? The rather loud request hit deaf ears. But Zoro wouldn't give up to talk some sense into him. Luffy, as you are. Ace. Luffy retorted coldly, cutting Zoro off roughly. The older man froze in shock. Luffy hadn't spoken loud but the unexpected venomous tone was enough to shut him up. What? No. But it was too late. Luffy had misheard the word. As for Ace. Oh boy, now he'd triggered something. Inwardly, Zoro kicked himself. Luffy wasn't himself right now and he'd just hit a soft spot. Well done, Zoro, he congratulated himself. His captain glared before shouting. Where is he? With one sudden motion, Luffy thrust his head forward and knocked a really flabbergasted Zoro back. Accidentally, he let go of the younger one and Luffy seized his chance and jumped away from Zoro. Fuck. Zoro cursed and rubbed his sore forehead. He could already feel a bump forming. The swordsman didn't even want to think about how much this had to hurt Luffy, rubber or not. Ace. AC. Luffy began to shout, searching for a person that could not be there. It was painful to watch him stagger around in desperate search for his lost brother. Where are you? Luffy, calm down. Ace is not here. No, you are lying. Luffy screamed back, not quite recognizing the deep voice of his faithful first mate. Luffy. Zoro growled back harshly. He was losing his temper too fast but he couldn't help it. What did you do to him, you jerk? Shut up. Zoro roared. Ace is dead, he isn't here. It's me, Zoro. How can you think I'd do something to your brother? Luffy clutched his head as if in pain and squeezed his eyes shut, whimpering as he staggered to the side. Zoro's eyes widened and thanks to his trained reflexes he managed to catch Luffy in time. Oi, Luffy. Zoro lifted the younger one up a bit to see if he was still conscious, mild panic in his voice. No, Luffy only moaned back, panting softly. Slowly, with the rest of the little energy he had, he managed to get out of Zoro's grasp and pushed himself away from the strange man. "Leave me alone." Zoro bit his lip. Darn, it hurt to watch his friend act like this. But it hurt much more to be rejected by Luffy of all people. Zoro had overreacted and he knew it. The confused, unfocused, sad look Luffy had given him made Zoro feel guilty. Things wouldn't change for the better if he started to get violent now. Seeing this was going nowhere, Zoro made a decision. He had to get Luffy inside quickly, no matter what. By force if necessary. "Chopper!" Zoro shouted, turning his head towards the kitchen, hoping the reindeer was there and would hear him over the storm. There was nothing he could do beside that. Luffy was gone too far already. Zoro was unable to pry through that fog. He was just helpless and there was nothing Zoro loathed more than this feeling. "I'm really sorry, Luffy. But there's no other way," Zoro said and quickly jumped right in front of Luffy. The younger man was too surprised and dizzy to react in time and couldn't prevent Zoro grabbing him again. No 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 no. Luffy began to struggle again, hating this feeling of being trapped. He had to find Ace. This stranger had mentioned his name before, and Luffy was sure his brother was somewhere near. What if he was in danger? Luffy gasped before kicking his legs frantically. Arg, shit Luffy. Stop. Zoro unintentionally squeezed Luffy's shoulder harder as one leg hit him right in the stomach. Oof. Ace. Luffy's voice cracked slightly at the end. The wind carried the lonely name away into nothingness. Suddenly, Luffy kicked with all of his might into Zoro's crotch. Zoro let out a pain-filled gasp and let go of Luffy for the second time. The delirious captain half robbed, half dragged himself away and Zoro's agony was all but forgotten when he saw fear in Luffy's eyes. The green-haired man clenched his fists with wide eyes as the truth grinned at him cheekily. He is afraid of me. Oh gods no. Get the hell away from me. This wasn't something Luffy would shout. Never would the 19 years old act scared and, like this. Heck, Luffy would never be afraid of anyone, let alone Zoro. Just how high was this damn fever of his? What did this accursed sickness do to his captain? If the illness was substantial, Zoro would fiercely shred it to tiny pieces without hesitation. Don't you recognize my voice, Sencho? Zoro muttered half-heartedly. To his surprise, Luffy groaned and shook his head. Hope was prying his way through sadness, and Zoro's lips twitched upwards slightly. Hey, Luffy, do you hear me? We're on the ship, the Sunny. Not quite the best weather to sit at the front and watch the ocean, huh? Zoro tried to smile encorally, not daring to move closer to a fragile Luffy. The captain didn't say anything for a very long time, and Zoro feared he'd blacked out, but suddenly, a very tired voice was heard and Luffy looked up with sluggish movements. Dark brown eyes met emerald ones. Zoro. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, they heard a sudden noise on the deck. First, Zoro calling for Chopper, then someone shouting in a desperate, strained voice, and they didn't like how this voice sounded exactly like Luffy's. Normally, something like this wouldn't have been heard over the usual commotion around that ship, but since there was a deafening silence in the kitchen it sounded unbelievable loud. The Straw Hats froze in their antics. Chopper still had the bottle of water in one hoof but didn't move to close the fridge. For a moment, a collective silence was ruling. They looked at each other and exchanged glances, until all of a sudden it clicked in their tired minds. He wouldn't. They all thought at the same time, coming to the same conclusion separately. Crap, Sanji whispered wide-eyed. When Zoro was calling for help, then it meant shit was about to get down. And that could only mean one thing. Before Sanji had a chance to finish his sentence, Nami jumped up and made a mad dash for the door, waking the others from their shock who quickly followed. Luffy. Chopper screamed in panic. He should have seen this coming. He should never have left Luffy's side in the first place. Even though their captain had a high fever and he shouldn't even be able to move let alone walk on his own, it didn't come completely unexpected. Leave it to Luffy to do something so reckless. The poor boy probably didn't even know what was going on. Outside, though it was already dark, they spotted a shady figure on deck. Luffy. They cried out in unison but he didn't move an inch. Instead, their leader just continued to lean on the railing and stared out at the dark ocean as if he was alone in this world. In his fevered state, he maybe was. Zoro was a few meters behind him, looking as if he didn't dare to touch the younger one because if he did, Luffy would shatter like glass. Hesitantly, Zoro took another step towards Luffy. Luffy. You, Chopper began frantically but it got swallowed by the cyborg's loud voice. Zoro, what happened? Frankie demanded, stopping short to get a good look at the scene before him. However, there was no answer. The swordsman chose to ignore the rest of the crew. This was something personal between him and his captain, and he needed to make sure Luffy's state wouldn't get worse. Maybe Zoro tried to help Luffy because he didn't want to feel completely useless, too. He just couldn't bear to watch and do nothing when everything around him was in disorder. Luffy. Ace is not here, is he? I am not at Marineford, right? Luffy's exhausted voice cut through the air and hit them like a ton of bricks. No one dared to speak up at first, not quite knowing what to say. Zoro bit his lip, turning to look at the soaked ground. Suddenly, he noticed Luffy wasn't even wearing his favorite piece of clothes, his hat. Everyone else frowned sadly. After what felt like a millennium, Robin slowly answered. No, Luffy. It's been 2 years since your brother died. It's over now. You're at your ship right now, and we are all here. She spoke in a firm but gentle voice. She wanted Luffy to understand he was not back at that awful place where they couldn't help him. He was with them and there was no need to feel alone. The tension got thicker, and Sanji watched Luffy like a hawk. The cook nearly bit off his cigarette's butt, so hard was he chewing on it. Shitty rubber brain, just say something, he murmured half-heartedly, and everyone knew he didn't even mean the insult. He never had and never would think of his captain as someone to seriously insult that way. It was just his way of showing affection. Luffy, Usopp asked carefully, but no answer came. Instead, they all watched anxiously how their leader turned around in what seemed slow motion. There was a sudden gust of wind, and at the same moment, a flash flooded the scene with brightness, creating a bizarre picture of a wet, smiling silhouette in the middle of the dark night. The crew gasped. It looked so horribly wrong. There were so many opposites in that break of the moment that it left the Straw Hats completely speechless. Wide eyes stared ahead and met a pair of unfocused ones. There he was, right before them. They only had to take one more step to touch him, to be able to take his hand and pull him nearer. But they'd never be able to pull him back from wherever he was. He was near yet so far away, unreachable in a way that made it painful to look at him. Yeah, it was painful. Something inside them squeezed uncomfortably as he suddenly smiled at them, and all at once, they were hit with a truth that tore through them like crocodile's hook tore through their captain once. It was the first time Luffy hurt them with his smile. It didn't seem fake, quite the reverse, it was a true, honest smile. Though that made it only worse. Not face-splitting like usual, not determined, and not even cheekily. It was a simple small grin. Like a greeting, he wanted to show them he was happy to see them. Yet it seemed so foreign on Luffy's face they all felt the urge to wipe it off. Luffy was sick, that much was painfully obvious as he stood there panting like a dog. Everything on the sunny screamed darkness, the situation couldn't be worse, and yet Luffy was absolutely oblivious to everything. Smiling innocently as if nothing was wrong, as if the sun was shining and there was another exciting adventure waiting for them. It hurt them more than anything else. It didn't cheer them up like it was supposed to. Instead, it was raining and storming, and there was this terrible atmosphere around them, the threatening loneliness that stuck to them like resin. How is it possible to feel lonely when you're surrounded by your dearest friends? And it was downright grotesque to think you could feel so sad and locked in with Luffy around, but it was true. Not being able to take it anymore, Nami began to cry, and the salty tears mixed with the raindrops. The water and the tears united in perfect harmony and rolled down Nami's reddened cheeks together. Who could blame her? Oh Luffy, please, please, what? She thought. Get better. Stop acting so strange. Don't scare us anymore. Please get better quickly, before we all break apart. Someone, help me carry him inside quickly. Chopper ordered softly. No one spoke when they brought a half-conscious Luffy back into the warm infirmary. They doubted he was even aware of being carried. This was just the beginning, they all feared it. What would the next day bring? Would things turn for the better, or would fate play another cruel trick on them? They didn't know. The darkness of the night threatened to sweep them away and the wind blew roughly. It was a stormy night when they lost their last bit of hope. Chapter 5 The World Knows. Crap, Sanji cursed under his breath for the umpteenth time. He stood in the infirmary together with Brook and Chopper, staring at his vulnerable captain whose lips had turned a dark shade of blue. Luffy seemed conscious, but he wasn't quite aware of his surroundings by the way his eyes stared half-opened ahead. The moment of clarity from before was gone. It was quite worrisome, and even the reindeer seemed unsure of what to do next. But Chopper was quick to make decisions, and when it came to his patience all the more. He was in full doctor mode, and Sanji was surprised at how calm the reindeer's voice sounded. Luffy is dripping wet. We need to get him warmed up as quick as possible. Chopper turned around to face the cook. Since Brook and me can't handle water very well, would you mind bathing him? He is freezing. True to Chopper's words, despite the high fever, Luffy was shivering violently. The water mustn't be too hot, and don't put him too long in there. Normally, Sanji would prefer a bath with his beautiful Robin or Nami, but of course he didn't mind at all. This was an expectation after all, and he quickly nodded silently. Zoro could bathe him as well, but Sanji doubted the Mosshead had the nerve for that right now. He had seemed pretty shaken earlier, his usual stoic facade shattered. But Sanji knew better than to make fun of him. They all looked horrible and exhausted, some of them were really pale, others had dark circles under their eyes, Sanji included. So who was he to talk? Without wasting any more time, Sanji lifted Luffy as gently as possible into his arms and went straight for the bathroom. Brook could only watch in slight amazement at how tender the cook acted around their captain. He sometimes forgot with all the arguments about food and the way he always kicked the boy harshly, but in reality Sanji deeply respected Luffy. It was rare moments like these that Brook could get a glimpse of Sanji's and Luffy's deep-rooted friendship. He had been one of the first crew members to join, after all, and had known Luffy for quite some time now. Snapping out of his stupor, Brook helped Chopper preparing the bed and the medicine he needed when Luffy had warmed up. Chopper-san, I know it's rude to ask you this now, but you really don't know the sickness Luffy-san has. Chopper stopped what he was doing and glanced at Brook with a surprised look on his face. He seemed thoughtful as if he were choosing his words carefully, and as he began to speak his glance wandered to the floor. You see, it's weird. He shows symptoms of the flu, but then again he's not being infected by the RNA virus, and not all the symptoms are fitting. Then I thought he might have gotten pneumonia by the way he has severe troubles breathing and his lungs are inflamed, though, there's something different about it. Later I suspected tuberculosis, but not one of the common antidotes work. In fact, hardly any medicine I've given Luffy has triggered an improvement. And that's what worries me most. I'm hardly able to control the symptoms, how should I cure him from this sickness? I don't even know the root of the problem or whether it's an infection or a virus. Brook, I'm at my wit's end. I've never seen or heard of anything like this. The doctor suddenly choked on a sob. Luffy was out of his sight, and Chopper's strong mask began to crumble and small tears rolled down his furry cheeks as he looked into Brook's empty eye sockets. I've tried so many things and searched all my books, but there's nothing I can find, nothing that might help Luffy. I don't know what I should do if he keeps getting worse. Brook, there's no way his bee body can take it for much longer. And I, the only one who can help him, have no idea what I should do. Brook's eyes would have softened if he had any and he bent down to pick the young doctor up like a father would pick up his child. Truth be told, even the skeleton didn't have an answer for that. He knew exactly how hard it was to sit by and be unable to do anything while time was running out. His first captain had died that way, and it would be unbearable for Brook if Luffy would have to share the same fate, at such a young age, too. He could understand Chopper better than anyone. Luffy couldn't die like this, but time was a merciless and cold enemy. Chopper continued in his broken-hearted rant. I shouldn't have left Luffy alone. How could I do that? It was unresponsive, and you all relied on me, too. Luffy could have fallen overboard, and his condition is worse than before. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. Chopper's eyes were squeezed shut as he whimpered those words of regret. It nearly broke Brook's heart at the sight of the doctor's emotional breakdown. Chopper-san, please don't let this eat you up so much. No one could have foreseen this. And in the end, Zoro-san was there. Brook said. Plus, it's our fault, too. We shouldn't have put so much pressure on you from the very start. Luffy's health is the responsibility of every member of the crew. Just because you are our doctor doesn't mean you have to watch Luffy 24 hours on no end. It's impossible to do that and we should have offered our help to you. He's a friend of us all and we're all concerned for his well-being. Chopper nodded slowly, Brook's words sinking in. Brook, what are we going to do? I don't want to watch Luffy suffering so much but I can't help him either. I'm failing Luffy. He tried to rub away the tears but he just couldn't help it at that moment. Everything seemed so dark, so hopeless. Brook's sharp intake of breath didn't stop the little reindeer to continue in a cracking voice. Doctrine would be disappointed in me. Chopper hiccuped, tears and snot mixing together. He had hardly cried these last days, and finally the barrage broke and all his emotions of frustration and anger and just utter incredulity came flooding out. Brook inhaled deeply to control his own emotions that boiled up inside of him. Don't say that, Chopper-san. For someone who has the heart to cry for the sake of his friend you feel nothing but respect. You have tried very hard the past days and we all know that. She's a doctor herself, isn't she? She out of all people would understand and she'd be proud of you because you keep working hard. Luffy believes in you, so you should start believing in yourself, too. I can know. Chopper sobbed again, and Brook suddenly realized how much this had hurt the poor reindeer. It must have eaten him up. The skeleton stroked Chopper's fur gently. Everyone was expecting him to miraculously find a cure for Luffy, to heal him like he always did. But how are you supposed to fight an enemy you don't know? He is the ship's only doctor carried a heavy burden on his tiny shoulders. The skeleton began to hum a silent song of comfort and let his small friend cry his heart out. YXYXY. Sanji found it extremely difficult to bathe Luffy. Not that he minded a naked Luffy, he couldn't care less about that, he was a guy, too. Besides, it's not like he's never seen Luffy nude. That guy obviously doesn't feel embarrassed about anything, so it was not a surprise to them that he would often run around naked, laughing happily and not giving a care in the world. Sanji cringed slightly as he was unintentionally reminded how many times his Nami-san and Robin Kwan had to see Luffy without clothes when he'd suddenly sprint around the deck. When Luffy was better Sanji would kick his rubber butt for scaring his beautiful ladies. Though Robin didn't really mind and found it highly amusing. What really disturbed Sanji, though, was how limp Luffy was in his arms. It was just utterly horrible to do this with someone that felt like a rag doll. This was not the same man that saved him in the Baratie, beating Don Krieg senseless. Sanji clenched his teeth, holding Luffy's head over the water with one hand as he washed him with the other. Oh yeah, he would have to kick his rubber ass for making everyone worry so much, too. His thoughts were stopped when he could see some of the color coming back to Luffy's cheeks. Sanji sighed in relief. He actually looked a little better. Through all this, the captain remained oblivious. Somewhere during the middle he had slurred some words that had sounded as if he were drunken. Weren't it for the seriousness of this situation, Sanji would have laughed, because he hadn't understood anything. A cough that sounded pretty painful rattled the smaller one's body. This was hard. There was no laughs from Luffy, no stupid questions or silly statements. No playfully splashed water in the cook's face. Sanji wished Luffy would hurry up and let his insanely healing rate finally work its magic, because he really missed the daily begging for food and the demanding for more meat. He hated to admit it, but he really did. Things were too silent, too depressed, with Luffy acting like a comatose. How on earth could he have hidden his sickness from the crew before? They hadn't seen it coming at all. Sanji's fists clenched painfully. Damn it, Luffy, when are you going to come back? Sanji whispered, and Luffy just stared ahead tiredly. Meanwhile, on deck, Zoro's vision was spinning. Had that really happened? Had that really just happened? It seemed unreal, and so out of character it filled his stomach with dread. What kind of sickness did his captain have to make him act like this? No, it was not just that. Luffy wasn't just acting weird. Luffy was dying and their world was starting to tumble. The thought alone made everyone shudder with utter devastation. Couldn't they do anything? Was it their cruel fate to stand by his side and just watch everything? You okay, Zoro bro? Frankie asked and put a metallic hand on the swordsman's shoulder. Zoro tensed visible but didn't turn around. Frankie waited patiently for an answer, but it never came. Instead, the cyborg was met with an unreadable aura and the sound of raindrops drumming angrily against the wooden planks of the deck. It was as if even the heavens weren't pleased about the events. It's not your fault, you know. Someone needed to bring him back to reality. You did the right thing. Nami spoke gently, as if to make up for shouting at him in the kitchen earlier. She had somewhat calmed down, but her puffy, red eyes were still visible, even in the dark rain. This time, Zoro turned around and glared at them. Shut up, all of you. And with that, he stormed off and slammed the door behind him. Nami and the others were speechless and could only stare, but the navigator could have sworn there had been a glimpse of deep regret in Zoro's eye. What the hell? Frankie growled. Nami frowned. He's being such a child right now, why can't he just accept our help? He needs it. Usopp shook his head. Zoro's like that, you know. Always acting like a tough guy without emotions. But even he is not invincible. The others didn't reply. They didn't know whether Usopp was aware of the fact he just pulled them back to reality with that last statement. It was true, they were all just humans and no one was invincible. Things like hopelessness and sadness could get to anyone. They may be strong, but sometimes strength wasn't enough. He just doesn't know how to cope with this situation. Actually, none of us know how to. Frankie said, and no one could disagree to that. YXYXYXYXYXYX. Frankie was the first to volunteer keeping watch over Luffy. He still hadn't woken up, but then, no one expected him to. His fever hadn't worsened too much to Chopper's surprise and everyone's relief. Maybe that was finally Luffy's legendary fighting spirit that shimmered through the darkness, but no one wanted to get their hopes up too high. The little doctor had calmed down a little and regained some of his confidence as he enjoyed a cup of hot chocolate with the rest of the crew. He was unbelievably grateful that not one of his friends were blaming him for what happened. But then, Chopper hadn't really expected them to do so, but he was still glad about that. They were the best Nakama in the world. They even apologized to him for not supporting him enough in such an important matter. The thought of being able to rely on the others brought a small smile to Chopper's face. Sanji returned from the kitchen's counter with the last cup of hot chocolate and sat down at the kitchen table. The young cook fingered for his pack of cigarettes only to find it was empty. He sighed a little disappointed. After such a night he could really use a smoke right now. He looked at his tired, worn-out crewmates and his glance stopped at the silent form of the swordsman. Damn it, Marimo, you need to stop blaming yourself for something that wasn't your fault. Sanji grumbled half-heartedly. Luffy may have freaked out a little earlier, but he's okay right now. And someone needed to get him back to the presence. You did all you could do. Shut up. Zoro only grumbled back, not even attempting to insult Sanji like usual. The fact that the cook had unintentionally repeated Nami's words from before angered him even more, but Zoro wasn't in the mood to argue right now. Everyone was painfully aware of the fact that the earlier events had shocked the swordsman more than he let on. After all, he'd been the one who convinced himself the sickness wasn't that bad and Luffy would come out of this alive and unharmed quickly, like usual, like they all had gotten used to. That wasn't the case this time. It was as if a nightmare came true. To witness Luffy in such a delirious state earlier must have been a jump into ice-cold water for Zoro. Nami watched Zoro with sad eyes before she turned away with a deep sigh. Maybe the stubborn moron had finally comprehended the gravity of the situation. He just needed some time. The sniper of the Straw Hats, on the other hand, had other things on his mind and hardly paid attention to the others. He sweated a little. He knew he was having really negative thoughts about this, but he needed to know the opinions of his friends. So he finally decided to voice the question he'd turned and twisted around in his head all the time out loud. Hey, guys, what are we going to do? I mean, what if he... Usopp's small voice trailed off, but they all knew what he was implying. A collective, thick silence followed. They all had been wondering about that, each of them imagining all the possible scenarios and what was to happen to them afterwards. To them as a whole, as a crew. Would they still sail on? Or maybe they were dishonoring Luffy by giving room to that small, scary thought that could become cruel reality. Much to everyone's surprise, it was Brook who broke the silence finally. But what he said was even more shocking and sent a shiver down their spine. We need to prepare for the worst. No way. You can't be serious. I'm not going to accept. Nami was quickly cut off. Don't be silly. Luffy's still vulnerable and very much capable of dying, you said so yourself. Robin said with a cold edge to her voice. Nami's eyes widened before she bowed her head slowly. I know. I'm sorry everyone. But the thought of Luffy, it's just so scary I don't wanna think about it. He still has so much to do. He shouldn't be going through this shit. Sanji stood up, opened a cupboard and grabbed a new pack of cigarettes. He seemed to be smoking more and more every day. It may seem cold, but what Brook said is true. We have to be prepared for whatever may come. Even if it all happens too damn fast. No one realized the hard look on Sanji's face. We all have come on this ship for something and we have traveled too far to give up now. Zoro spoke up without any emotion in his voice. Damn it, do you think we don't know that already? Of course we won't give up now. Usopp replied, but it didn't sound very convincing at all. He hated how cold everyone was sounding. Robin's hard eyes softened a tad. No one here has thought of giving up. Ever. Come what may come. Brook agreed quietly. The dark silence returned, leaving everyone to their own thoughts. Chopper could only watch in shock as his eyes wandered from one face to the next. He couldn't believe this. These weren't the friends he knew and loved so much. These persons were all just gray. It was unbelievable how much they had changed the past few days. Were they really just settling things like this? Were they able to accept this horrible fact this easily? Well, Chopper couldn't. He couldn't, and he would not kill Luffy off like this. He still had some time. Not much, but Chopper somehow had to find a way to cure Luffy. There just had to be a way. With one determined face he stood up and left the kitchen to return to the infirmary. The rest of the crew watched him leave with different expressions and mixed emotions. YXYXY. Even though the Marines managed to sneak up on their ship and surprise them with their attack, the crew was doing a nice job of defending the Sunny. They were all pretty tired and had caught little to no sleep last night, but their anger towards an invisible enemy seemed to strengthen them enough to fight. It felt strange to fight against the Marines without Luffy running around, laughing madly to show how much he enjoyed his pirate life. Somewhere during the fight, the crew half expected a shout of Gomu Gomu no Pistol. Or something like that, which of course never came. Instead, the air was filled with clashes of swords and the sound of bodies hitting the deck. It felt like a suffocating silence to the Straffuts. The Marines were losing badly. Though they weren't idiots and soon realized that there was one person missing, Strafut Luffy. They briefly wondered what had happened to the rubber captain. Mutiny. Or did he have some kind of accident? Whatever it was affecting the rest of the crew badly, that much they could tell. The aura around the Straffuts was much more threatening than usual, and they didn't seem to enjoy their fight at all. They didn't exchange words or even glances. Everyone just tried to beat as much Marines as possible, trying to get rid of that tension around them by force. One Marine fighter was especially lucky. He had the privilege to meet Roronoa Zoro, who, today, really lived up to his nickname Demon Hunter. The young man tried his best to fight back, but against the incredible force of Zoro's swords and the sheer madness in his eyes he didn't stand a chance. He tried to dodge out of the way since he couldn't land a hit at all, but even that wasn't working. Zoro didn't let him. The poor Marine guy felt like a punching bag as Zoro released all of his frustration on him at once. With one last mighty slash, he was tossed into the dark sea of cold unconsciousness. At that moment, Zoro felt like a giant stepping on small, annoying bugs. He never thought of fights like that, even against weaklings. Each fight was important, a small test of his own strength and limits. It shouldn't be dishonored by fighting out of pure lust to hurt others. But today everything was different. Today Zoro embraced the chance of fighting against Marines as if it'd ease Luffy's pain. The fight went on, but it was put to a stop as the crew heard a surprised yelp coming out of the infirmary. Frankie, Brook and Zoro were the first ones to react as they quickly stormed to the sick bay with fury in their eyes. Some Marine had dared to intrude Chopper's room where the little doctor was nursing Luffy. For the crew, that act was unforgivable. Before the crew reached the infirmary, the door flew open and a Marine flew out and crashed against the mast. He was out cold. For a moment, the other Marines were frozen as Chopper stepped out in his human form, anger barely contained. "Don't you dare touch him, bastards!" He barked and slammed the door shut again, leaving the rest to the others. He was in the middle of creating a new medicine that might help ease some of Luffy's pain, and anyone who distracted him received a harsh treatment. The rest of the crew silently congratulated Chopper for successfully protecting their captain and kicking the guy out. Then, they decided it was enough and managed to force the Marines to return to their ship and flee. No one thought it was strange how fast they were gone. They had other things on their mind. But soon they'd learn the truth behind the Marines' weird behavior. Ixi. The next morning, everyone was on their own, doing small chores or reading books, just to occupy their minds with something else. Constantly worrying was pretty tiring and only made the situation worse. Some of them tried to get a glimpse of sleep. Everything was relatively calm, but all of a sudden a loud shriek tore through the silence. Quickly, everyone stopped what they were doing and dashed to the woman's quarter where the scream had come from. What happened? Nami-san, what's wrong? Nami. She bit her lip and held up the newspapers of that day for everyone to read. What they saw made their blood freeze and stomach turn upside down. This couldn't be real. Usopp's eyes widened. Oh my god. It was a picture of Luffy lying in bed, obviously out cold, with the words, "Strafut Luffy fell ill with deadly sickness," written below. It was a simple sentence, but for the pirates it meant a hard blow. Now it was for sure that every ribble on this vast ocean would sense their chance and come after them. It was practically an invitation for bounty hunters and hateful pirates. All above, for the Marines. The crew gasped in shock. As if they didn't have enough problems to deal with already. Crap, how did these damn shitheads find out so fast? Sanji all but shouted. Now it would be impossible for them to even set one foot on land without people attacking them. When did they take a picture? Nami asked. Chopper gasped. It must have been the guy who entered the infirmary yesterday. He knocked me aside and he hovered over Luffy for a few seconds. He must have had a camera with him. Zoro growled dangerously. I should have cut that asshole up yesterday. How low of the Marines. Brooke said in anger. Robin put a finger to her chin and thought. Now that I think about it, he didn't really look like an average Marine fighter. The clothes he wore were a little different from the others' clothes. Maybe he was some sort of journalist. The Marines have journalists in their crews. Usopp asked in shock. Doesn't that seem unreal? Unless, Nami gasped. Not if they had planned this outcome all along. Robin said. Her friends blinked before realization dawned on them. No way.